If you're looking for monsters, check the mirror, Lyra Vale once told her officers as the sky above Kareth City turned the color of burning copper, and she believed it with every steady beat of her pulse until the night a human carried her through the fire. The air smelled of melted alloy and rain that never reached the ground, caught in thermal drafts rising off fractured towers that scraped 1,200 feet into a sky choked with ash. Warning sirens pulsed in low, exhausted waves, and the marble steps of the High Council trembled under distant impacts that felt less like explosions and more like the planet exhaling in pain. Commander Lyra Vale stood alone beneath the cracked archway of the transit spire, her cerulean skin dulled by soot, silver hair unbound and heavy against her shoulders, gold eyes fixed on the horizon where human carriers hovered like dark silhouettes against the smoke. She did not tremble, because officers did not tremble, and she did not look away, because leaders did not look away. Yet somewhere beneath the discipline and the uniform stitched with constellations, a single thought circled like a trapped bird. This is what they do, this is what humans bring. Her gauntlet display flickered at 42% power, environmental shields thinning, and she tasted metal at the back of her throat as emergency broadcasts scrolled across her lens in tight, efficient lines. Evacuation corridors were collapsing, civilian transports rerouted, infrastructure failing in sectors measured in square miles, not blocks, and still she remained, cataloging damage with the same calm precision she had once used to authorize counterstrikes months ago when the war had still felt distant, strategic, almost theoretical. She remembered the briefing room light reflecting off polished stone, the holographic map rotating slowly, human fleet signatures blinking like invasive stars, and her own voice, measured, unwavering, approving maneuvers meant to push them back beyond the asteroid belt. She had told herself it was defense, that preemption was survival, that humans expanded until something stopped them. And tonight as heat rolled down the boulevard in shimmering waves and glass rained softly from a tower half a mile away, she told herself the same thing again. A shockwave rippled through the transit spire, not violent but insistent, like a hand pressing too hard against a closed door, and the floor shifted beneath her boots. Overhead, structural beams groaned, ancient stone cracking with a sound like distant thunder, and for the first time her balance faltered as the archway fractured, cascading fragments scattering across the steps in a glittering storm of debris. Her suit compensated, stabilizers engaging, but the ground opened in a jagged seam along the plaza, heat rising from ruptured conduits, and Lyra stepped back one pace too late as the edge gave way beneath her heel. She dropped only a few feet into the slanted cavity of the collapsed entryway, armor absorbing most of the impact, yet the air rushed from her lungs and her display dimmed to 38%. Emergency lighting casting the world in pulsing red. Above her, the skyline blurred behind drifting smoke, and somewhere beyond the haze she heard the distinct hum of human atmospheric engines descending through the clouds, not close enough to see, just close enough to remind her that this ruin had authors. She pressed her palm against the cracked stone beside her, steadying herself, and lifted her gaze toward the burning horizon. Her voice, low and controlled despite the dust and heat, slipped into the darkness of the cavity as if addressing the planet itself. Humans started this, she whispered, not in fear, not in rage, but in conviction sharpened by loss, and in that moment, before footsteps crunched across the shattered plaza above her and a shadow paused at the broken edge of the spire, Lyra Vale believed that if a human stood over her now, she would rather fall into the fire than accept his hand boots scraped against broken stone above her, careful, deliberate, not the frantic rhythm of someone fleeing but the measured pace of someone searching, and Lyra felt the tremor of each step through the fractured slab that pinned her lower leg in place. Her gauntlet display flickered again at 34% power, environmental seal compromised but holding, and she angled her body toward the opening with her pulse rifle raised despite the warning icon flashing along the side of her vision. A silhouette appeared at the jagged edge of the transit spire, framed by smoke and the dim orange glow of distant fires, broad shoulders outlined against drifting ash, helmet visor reflecting the ruined skyline like a broken mirror. The armor was unmistakable even through distortion, matte gray composite plating marked with the faint white insignia of a United Earth Marine unit. He did not fire. He did not speak. He crouched instead, lowering himself until his visor aligned with her position, studying the collapse with a stillness that unsettled her more than aggression would have. "Stay back," Lyra said, her voice steady though dust burned in her lungs. "I will not be taken." The figure tilted his head slightly, as if processing tone rather than threat, then reached up and unsealed his helmet. Compressed air hissed softly as the faceplate lifted, revealing a man perhaps in his early 30s, pale skin smudged with soot, short brown hair damp with sweat, eyes a clear gray that scanned the debris before meeting hers without triumph or cruelty. "You are pinned," he said, his voice low, American accent edged with controlled breath. "If this beam shifts another inch, it will drop the rest of the archway." She tightened her grip on the rifle. "Better that than surrender." A faint rumble rolled through the plaza, not sharp but insistent, and fine particles sifted down from the cracked stone above her shoulder. The Marine glanced upward, calculating weight and angle, then back to her. "I am not here to take you anywhere," he replied. "I am trying to keep that ceiling from deciding for both of us." His wrist display projected a narrow beam of light that traced the fracture lines along the slab, highlighting stress points in pale blue. Lyra's training recognized the assessment instantly: structural failure within minutes, perhaps less if the thermal currents intensified. She hated that he was correct. She hated more that he sounded calm. "Why are you alone?" she demanded. "Your fleet owns the sky." He gave the smallest shake of his head. "I lost my unit 2 blocks east when the corridor collapsed. I am not sure who owns anything right now." The answer carried no accusation, only fact, and something in that absence unsettled her certainty. Another tremor rippled through the ground, stronger this time, and the slab across her leg shifted half an inch. Pain flared sharp and immediate, her suit compensators struggling to redistribute weight. The Marine moved before she could protest, bracing one boot against intact stone and gripping the edge of the fractured beam with both hands, composite gloves strained, servos in his forearm armor whining softly as he tested the load. "On my mark," he said, eyes never leaving the fault line. "You pull. Your leg free. Do not argue with me." "You presume command," she snapped. "I presume gravity," he answered, jaw tightening as he leveraged upward just enough to ease the pressure. The slab lifted a fraction, dust cascading in a shimmering curtain, and Lyra felt space return around her trapped limb. Pride warred with survival for less than a heartbeat before instinct won, and she wrenched her leg backward as the beam settled into a new, precarious angle. For a suspended second they remained frozen in the red pulse of emergency light, her rifle still raised, his arms locked against a weight that could crush them both if misjudged. And through the smoke and heat she realized with a jolt she did not expect that the human had chosen not to step away when he easily could have, that he had seen an enemy beneath the rubble and calculated not advantage but structural integrity, and as the sirens wailed somewhere beyond the plaza and ash drifted between them like gray snow, Lyra Vale understood that the night had shifted in a way no battlefield map had ever predicted. The beam settled with a grinding sigh, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if the entire plaza were balancing on the thin edge of a decision. Lyra eased her leg fully free and forced herself upright despite the tremor in her muscles, her suit diagnostics recalibrating around a strain warning that pulsed amber along her peripheral display. The human released the fractured slab slowly, inch by careful inch, until its weight rested against a new angle of stone. Then he stepped back without advancing toward her, palms open and empty in a gesture that required no translation across species. Heat rolled through the collapsed archway in heavy waves, carrying the scent of ionized metal and rain that evaporated before touching ground, and above them the skyline flickered as emergency grids failed sector by sector. "You should seal your helmet," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. "The particulate levels exceed safe limits for your physiology." He glanced at the drifting ash, then at her, and gave a brief nod before resealing the visor. Compressed air locked into place with a muted click, his voice returning through external speakers, slightly filtered but still unmistakably human. "Thank you for the medical advisory," he replied. "I will log that as cooperation." The word lingered between them like a fragile bridge neither wished to acknowledge. A distant tremor pulsed through the ground again, softer this time yet closer, and Lyra's gaze snapped toward the eastern corridor where a transit line had once run 300 yards from the plaza. through the smoke she could make out the faint silhouette of automated reconnaissance units drifting lower, their navigation lights blinking in disciplined formation. Human machines. Scanning. Mapping. Her jaw tightened. They will sweep this sector, she said. If they identify me, extraction will not be their priority. The Marine followed her line of sight, visor optics narrowing as data scrolled across his internal display. If they identify me alone in a compromised civilian zone, that will not improve my position either, he answered. There was no bitterness in the statement, only calculation. She studied him more closely now, noting the scuffed insignia on his shoulder plate, the faint crease along his brow that suggested exhaustion measured not in hours but in months. This was not a commander issuing orders from orbit, but a man on the ground, separated from his unit, breathing the same heated air she was. State your designation, she demanded. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker, United Earth Marine Corps, he said without hesitation. And you are Commander Lyra Vale of the Kareth Defense Fleet. It was not a question. Her fingers tightened around the rifle. You recognize me. Your image circulated through our briefings, he replied. You were listed as Strategic Command. The accusation she expected did not follow. Instead he added, which means if anyone is searching this plaza, it will not be for me. The implication settled heavily in her chest. She had once reviewed projections that listed human casualties in clean numerical columns, probabilities and percentages detached from faces. Now one of those faces stood less than 10 feet away, choosing to remain rather than withdraw. Another rumble shuddered through the fractured spire, dislodging a cascade of fine debris that shimmered in the red emergency glow. Ethan angled his head toward a narrow service corridor partially visible beyond the collapsed stairwell. There is a maintenance tunnel approximately 40 yards north, he said, as if reciting from memory. It runs beneath the plaza and connects to a transit shelter. Structural integrity is rated higher than this archway. Lyra hesitated only a fraction of a second before responding. You expect me to follow you into a confined space? I expect the ceiling to continue its current behavior, he answered evenly. Silence pressed in around them, broken only by distant sirens and the soft hiss of cooling metal. She had sworn never to place trust in a human hand again, yet the ground beneath her boots felt less certain than the man standing before her. When another tremor rippled through the stone and a crack spidered across the arch overhead, Lyra Vale made a decision no battle plan had prepared her for and lowered her rifle just enough to signal movement rather than surrender. They moved without agreement, only momentum, boots crunching over fractured marble as another crack split the archway behind them with a sharp report that echoed through the smoke. Ethan led by half a step, not close enough to touch her, just far enough to shield her. From loose debris sliding from the broken facade, his shoulder angled toward the narrow service corridor he had marked. The plaza felt longer than it had minutes before, every yard stretched by heat distortion and drifting ash that turned streetlights into blurred halos, and Lyra kept her rifle lowered but ready, eyes tracking the slow descent of reconnaissance units sweeping the skyline in disciplined arcs. 40 yards, Ethan said quietly, glancing at the coordinates on his wrist display. Tunnel entrance should be beneath that collapsed signage. The sign in question had once displayed transit schedules in 3 languages. Now it lay twisted across the pavement, metal ribs exposed like the frame of a fallen wing. Lyra reached it first, gripping the edge with both hands, suit servos assisting as she shifted the weight enough to expose a recessed maintenance hatch beneath. The hatch was sealed, control panel dark, but a manual override will protruded from its center. Ethan knelt beside her without hesitation and braced one knee against the ground. On 3, he said. 1. 2. 3. They turned the wheel together, resistance grinding through the mechanism until it released with a metallic click and the hatch lifted several inches, exhaling a rush of cooler air from below that carried the faint scent of ozone and damp concrete. For a second they both paused, listening. Above them the city groaned under distant strain, but from the tunnel there was only the soft hum of emergency power cycling through backup circuits. Ethan lowered himself first, dropping approximately 6 feet onto a narrow maintenance platform and immediately stepping aside to create space. Lyra followed, landing lightly despite the ache in her leg, and the hatch swung closed above them as Ethan pulled it down, sealing out much of the smoke and heat. The corridor stretched in both directions, 8 feet wide, lined with conduits and fiber bundles that pulsed with intermittent light. Condensation beaded along the walls, reflecting the red emergency glow in faint ripples. Lyra activated a low-intensity beam from her gauntlet, sweeping it across the floor to confirm structural integrity. "Your assessment was correct," she said after a moment. "The load-bearing supports are intact." Ethan removed his helmet once more, drawing in the cooler air with a measured breath before resting the helmet against his thigh. "I try to avoid being crushed whenever possible," he replied, the hint of dry humor almost lost beneath the distant rumble overhead. They began moving north along the corridor, footsteps echoing in rhythmic cadence, and for the first time since the archway collapsed there was a sense of contained space around them, walls that did not sway with thermal drafts or shed fragments with every tremor. After several yards Lyra slowed, noticing the way Ethan's right arm hung slightly stiff at his side, micro-fracture spidering across the outer plating of his forearm armor where he had braced the beam. "You sustained damage," she observed. "Armor only," he answered. "No penetration." She studied him a fraction longer than necessary, then adjusted her pace to match his rather than surge ahead. "The transit shelter lies approximately 300 yards from this point," she said. "It was designed to withstand sustained bombardment." "Then that is where we are going," he replied simply. Above them another distant tremor rolled through the city, muted by layers of reinforced stone, and Lyra realized that within this narrow corridor beneath a burning skyline, the war felt less like a clash of fleets and more like two figures walking side by side through dim light, bound not by alliance but by the fragile choice to keep each other alive long enough to reach the next door. The corridor narrowed as they advanced, the ceiling lowering by several inches where older infrastructure intersected with newer reinforcement beams, and the air grew cooler with each step away from the plaza above. Condensation gathered along exposed pipes and dripped in slow, rhythmic taps that echoed like distant clocks counting down something neither of them could see. Ethan walked slightly ahead but not out of reach, helmet secured once more, visor reflecting the dim red pulses of emergency lighting that flickered every few seconds along the wall. Lyra kept pace despite the persistent ache in her leg, refusing to show strain, though her internal diagnostics registered minor ligament stress and a gradual drop in suit power to 30%. After nearly 200 yards, the corridor opened into a junction chamber approximately 20 feet wide, reinforced with cross-braced steel and lined with sealed access doors marked in both Kareth script and simplified Earth glyphs that had been added after early treaty negotiations years ago. The sight of both languages on the same wall felt like a memory from another lifetime. Ethan slowed and lifted his wrist display, scanning for signal interference. "There is intermittent activity above us," he said quietly. "Recon units are still mapping heat signatures." Lyra nodded once, stepping toward a recessed panel near the shelter door. "The transit refuge lies beyond this bulkhead," she said. "Capacity, 300 civilians. Independent air filtration for 72 hours. She placed her palm against the biometric scanner, and for a breathless moment the system remained dark, then, with a low hum, a thin band of blue light swept across her skin and the panel illuminated. "Commander authorization recognized," the system announced in her native language before translating into English. "Emergency access granted." Ethan did not comment on the title, though his posture shifted almost imperceptibly at the confirmation of her rank. The heavy door slid open with controlled precision, revealing a dim shelter chamber lit by soft white strips along the floor. Inside, several dozen civilians clustered near the far wall, wrapped in thermal blankets, their eyes wide but alert rather than panicked. A few turned at the sound of the door, expressions tightening when they registered the silhouette of a human marine framed in the entrance. Lyra stepped forward immediately, lowering her rifle completely and raising her hand in a steadying gesture. "Stand down," she said in a clear, commanding tone. "He is not your enemy in this corridor." The words felt heavier than any weapon she had carried. Ethan remained near the threshold, not advancing, helmet angled downward slightly as if to minimize his presence. A young Kareth child, no more than 4 feet tall, stared at him with open curiosity rather than fear, silver eyes reflecting the pale shelter lights. The child tugged at Lyra's sleeve. "Is he the one from the sky?" the child asked softly. Lyra glanced at Ethan, then back at the child. "He is the one who helped open the door," she replied. The distinction mattered. Ethan shifted his weight, scanning the chamber for structural integrity rather than faces, and finally removed his helmet again, revealing a face drawn with exhaustion but absent of hostility. "You have approximately 60 minutes before the upper sector stabilizes or collapses further," he said calmly, addressing Lyra but loud enough for the shelter to hear. "After that, movement will become unpredictable." The civilians absorbed the information in silence, and Lyra studied the humans standing in their doorway, aware that he could have reported her position the moment her identity was confirmed. Instead he had walked beside her through smoke and stone and now stood guard at a threshold that was not his own. In the quiet hum of filtered air and distant tremors above, she felt something shift again, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in ice that had seemed unbreakable only hours before. The shelter door sealed with a low hydraulic hum, muting the distant sirens into a dull vibration that traveled through the reinforced walls like a fading heartbeat, and for the first time since the plaza collapsed the air felt controlled, filtered, almost calm. Overhead lighting adjusted from emergency red to a steady white glow, revealing tired faces, dust-streaked uniforms, and the quiet discipline of civilians who had learned in the span of hours how to wait without knowing what they were waiting for. Ethan remained near the entrance, helmet resting under one arm, scanning structural readouts from a small portable module clipped to his belt, his brow furrowed as data scrolled across the display, thermal patterns shifting above them in slow, unstable currents. Lyra moved through the chamber with measured authority, speaking softly to a group of elders seated near the rear wall, confirming air supply levels, water reserves, and medical capacity. She knelt briefly beside the child who had spoken earlier, adjusting the thermal wrap around the small shoulders before rising again with controlled composure. When she returned toward the front of the shelter, she found Ethan studying the ceiling as though he could see through 12 feet of reinforced composite and stone. "There is a pressure variance in the north quadrant," he said without turning. "Not catastrophic, but increasing. If debris settles unevenly, this chamber may lose power." Lyra stepped beside him, activating her gauntlet interface to cross-reference his readings with the shelter's internal diagnostics. The numbers aligned more than she expected. "Your equipment integrates with our grid," she observed. "Temporary compatibility patch," he replied. "War forces creativity." The statement carried weight beyond engineering. A faint tremor rolled through the chamber, gentle but persistent, and a ripple of unease passed among the civilians. Ethan glanced toward them, then back at Lyra. "There is an auxiliary access corridor 50 yards west of here," he said. "It leads to a surface service ramp designed for maintenance crews. If the main transit lines fail, that ramp might remain viable." Lyra studied the schematic hovering between them. "That ramp opens within sight of the eastern plaza," she said slowly. "The area currently under human aerial sweep." "Yes," he answered. There was no triumph in the admission. Only fact. Silence settled between them, heavier than the reinforced door. She understood the implication: evacuation might require passing through a zone monitored by his own forces. "You could signal them," she said at last, not accusing, simply stating possibility. Ethan's gray eyes met hers directly. "I could," he said. "But they are scanning for hostile signatures. If they detect your command codes, response protocols will activate before explanations." The words were careful, deliberate. She recognized restraint when she heard it. Another tremor, closer this time, sent a faint shower of dust drifting from a seam near the ceiling. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Lyra inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of rank settle across her shoulders, heavier than armor. "If this chamber destabilizes, we will move," she said. "You will guide us through the service ramp." It was not surrender. It was decision. Ethan inclined his head once in acknowledgement, no smile, no relief, only acceptance of responsibility. Around them the civilians resumed their quiet murmurs, unaware of how narrow the margin had become between safety and uncertainty. In the filtered hush beneath a city still burning above, Lyra realized that trust did not arrive as a sudden declaration, it formed in increments, in shared calculations and unspoken restraint, in the choice. To stand beside someone who represented everything she had sworn to oppose and still believe that survival could mean more than victory. The tremor did not announce itself with noise but with absence. The steady hum of filtered air stuttered once, lights dimming to a low amber glow before returning in uneven pulses, and Ethan's portable module emitted a sharp tone that cut cleanly through the chamber's cautious quiet. He looked down at the readout and felt his stomach tighten. North quadrant integrity just dropped 12%, he said, already moving toward the reinforced bulkhead that concealed the auxiliary corridor. Another subtle vibration traveled through the floor, strong enough this time to send a fine crack along one ceiling seam, a thin line spreading like frost across glass. Lyra was beside him in seconds, issuing calm, precise instructions to the civilians, her voice steady despite the shifting numbers scrolling across her gauntlet display. Collect only what you can carry in one hand, she ordered. Remain in pairs. Follow the Marine's lead. No one argued. The child with silver eyes gripped an elder's hand and stared at Ethan as if measuring whether he truly understood the weight now placed upon him. He met the gaze briefly, then keyed open the auxiliary panel embedded in the wall. The door resisted for half a breath before sliding aside, revealing a narrow corridor sloping upward at a 10-degree incline, emergency strips along the floor casting pale guidance lines toward a distant hatch. Distance is approximately 50 yards, he said. We move now. The line formed quickly, footsteps echoing in tight cadence as they entered the corridor, the air cooler but charged with tension that felt almost electric. Halfway up the incline another tremor rolled beneath them, stronger than the last, and dust drifted from overhead conduits in a soft gray curtain. A low metallic groan reverberated behind them as the shelter chamber absorbed stress it had not been designed to endure indefinitely. Ethan stopped at the base of a structural support beam, glancing at the sensor readings flashing red across his display. The ceiling over the main chamber is shifting, he said quietly to Lyra. If that beam fails, the corridor will remain intact, but the shelter may not. She understood immediately. The civilians were still moving forward, unaware that the margin for delay had narrowed to seconds. Ethan looked up the incline. Toward the surface hatch, then back toward the shelter door barely visible through the bend in the corridor. Go, he said to her. Guide them to the ramp. You will not remain, she replied, voice low but firm. Someone has to stabilize that beam long enough for the last group to clear the incline, he answered. There was no drama in his tone, only assessment. The support brace can be manually locked from the maintenance side. Lyra stepped closer, her gold eyes reflecting the dim emergency lights. That brace is rated for automated adjustment, not manual override, she said. It will require sustained pressure. I know, he replied. For a fraction of a second the war vanished from the space between them, replaced by something far more personal and far more fragile. You once asked why I did not signal my unit, he continued quietly. This is the same answer. Another tremor shuddered through the corridor, sharper now, and a faint crack echoed from the direction of the shelter. Ethan placed his helmet back over his head and sealed it with a soft hiss, then stepped past her toward the structural brace without waiting for permission. Lyra watched him position himself beneath the beam, forearm armor braced against reinforced steel, servos whining as he engaged manual lock protocols. The civilians moved past her toward the incline's crest, and she stood suspended between command and instinct, aware that the human she had once sworn to oppose was now the only thing preventing the ceiling from deciding the fate of everyone beneath it. The corridor felt smaller with every passing second, the air thick with dust and the strained hum of metal under pressure, and Ethan planted his boots against the reinforced floor plates, forearm braced against the manual override lever as the support beam above him shuddered in uneven pulses. Warning icons flashed across his visor in steady amber waves, servo load climbing past recommended tolerance, but he did not adjust his stance. 50 yards up the incline, the last cluster of civilians moved toward the surface hatch in a tight line, guided by Lyra's voice carrying calm authority even as her gauntlet display showed structural integrity dropping in slow, unforgiving increments. "Keep moving," she instructed, hands steady on the shoulder of the silver-eyed child as they reached the crest. "Do not look back." The hatch controls responded sluggishly, then slid open with a hydraulic sigh, revealing a service ramp angled toward the eastern plaza, night air spilling down into the corridor in a rush of heat and drifting ash. Beyond the ramp, the skyline glowed dimly through smoke, and faint silhouettes of reconnaissance craft traced disciplined arcs overhead, scanning for signatures against the fractured cityscape. Lyra turned back toward the incline and saw Ethan still beneath the beam, armor trembling under sustained pressure, micro-fractures spreading across the composite plating along his forearm where the manual brace resisted automated release. "Walker," she called down the corridor, her voice sharper now, stripped of formal rank. "They are clear." "Not yet," he replied, breath controlled but heavier, as a fresh tremor rippled through the structure and the beam shifted another fraction of an inch. A crack echoed behind him from the direction of the main shelter chamber, a sound like distant thunder rolling through hollow stone. His display registered a spike in load stress that pushed the brace into the red zone. If he released too soon, the corridor would absorb the shock before the final pair reached open air. He waited until he saw Lyra guide the last elder across the threshold and onto the ramp, then engaged the manual lock sequence with a decisive motion, forcing the brace into a fixed position designed for temporary stabilization. The beam settled with a grinding protest, holding just long enough. "Go," he said, and this time she did not hesitate. Lyra moved down the incline toward him, boots striking the floor in controlled urgency, and reached his position as another vibration coursed through the walls. The beam overhead groaned but remained in place. "Release it," she ordered. "The ramp is clear." Ethan disengaged the override and stepped back as the support system recalibrated into its emergency configuration, shifting load to adjacent columns with a deep mechanical resonance that echoed through the corridor. For a suspended second they stood facing one another in the dim red glow, the war above reduced to distant hums and flickers beyond reinforced stone. "You could have left," she said quietly. "So could you," he answered. Another tremor urged them forward, and together they moved up the incline toward the open hatch, heat washing over them as they stepped onto the service ramp beneath a sky still burning at the edges. Recon lights swept across the plaza in slow arcs, pausing when they detected motion, and Lyra felt the weight of what would follow pressing in from every direction. Ethan adjusted the small locator module at his belt, then looked at her once more through the thin veil of drifting ash. "Whatever happens next," he said evenly, "you get your people clear." The ramp vibrated under a distant impact, and above them the scanning lights shifted course, beginning to converge on the heat signatures rising from the open hatch. The scanning lights tightened into deliberate arcs above the service ramp, pale beams cutting through smoke and ash as reconnaissance craft adjusted their trajectory, engines humming with clinical precision, and Ethan felt the locator module at his belt vibrate softly as it synchronized with overhead systems that recognized his armor signature. Lyra saw the subtle shift in his posture, the fractional stillness that comes when a decision is already forming. "They are locking on to you," she said, voice low but steady over the distant mechanical hum. He nodded once, eyes tracking the converging lights. "They are locking onto my transponder," he corrected. 50 feet down the ramp, civilians moved toward the shadowed edge of the plaza where fractured buildings offered partial cover from aerial sweep, their figures small against the vastness of a city still glowing at the seams. The silver-eyed child glanced back one last time, and Lyra lifted her hand in a silent signal to keep going. Another sweep of light brushed across the ramp, pausing when it detected the concentrated heat at their position. Ethan unclipped the locator module with a measured motion and held it in his palm, the device no larger than a deck of cards, its surface pulsing with a soft blue beacon that told the sky exactly who he was. "If that stays here," Lyra said, understanding arriving like cold air, "they will not see them." He met her gaze through drifting ash, gray eyes calm despite the tremor vibrating faintly through the ramp beneath their boots. "You once said humans started this," he replied evenly. "Maybe some did. I cannot change that tonight. He looked toward the civilians now almost clear of the ramp. But I can change where this signal ends. Without ceremony he stepped away from the incline and walked 10 yards down the open stretch of plaza, placing the locator module atop a fractured piece of transit signage that rose several feet above ground level, ensuring a clean line of sight to the scanning craft. The blue pulse brightened as it synced fully, and overhead the recon lights shifted instantly, focusing with unmistakable intent. Lyra felt the urge to follow him, to pull him back toward the ramp, but she understood the geometry of what he was doing, distance measured in yards, angles calculated in seconds, and the narrow window required for the last civilian to disappear behind cover. "Walker," she called softly. He did not turn at first. He stood facing the sky, shoulders squared not in defiance but in acceptance, and then he looked back once, a brief glance that held no accusation, no regret, only acknowledgement. "Get them clear, Commander," he said. The scanning beams intensified around the beacon, isolating its signal from the background chaos of a damaged city, and Lyra moved. She guided the final pair off the ramp and into the shadowed corridor between two reinforced structures, counting steps until the angle of the plaza concealed them from aerial view. When she turned again, the service ramp lay empty except for the faint blue pulse of a locator drawing the sky's attention away from every other life beneath it. The recon lights hovered over that point with unwavering focus, engines humming in controlled descent, and Lyra stood within the shelter of fractured stone, watching as a single human silhouette remained beneath the burning edges of her city's horizon. She did not see fear in his stance, only resolve shaped by something quieter than war. In that suspended moment between signal and consequence, Lyra Vale understood that hatred had always been the simplest answer, and that the harder one was standing alone in the open so others did not have to. The lights above shifted once more, and the blue pulse on the fractured sign reflected briefly in her gold eyes before she turned to lead her people into the deeper shadows, carrying with her the knowledge that one human had chosen not conquest, not victory, but mercy.